Welcome to the webinar. Our webinar today is Potential Challenges and Pitfalls of Submitting Pay Data in the 2019 EEO-1 Report. Our presenters will be Joanna Kim Brunetti, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs, and Mark Dwyer, PhD, Vice President of Data Science, both of First Capital Consulting. Now to our speakers. Joanna Kim Brunetti is formerly a partner with Aiken Gump Strauss Hauer and Feld. She has over 20 years of experience advising clients on a wide range of employment tax, intellectual property, and other related business opportunities. She brings additional regulatory compliance experience from her pre-legal career in the consulting and aerospace industry. Joanna holds a BSc degree in chemical engineering from the University of California, Berkeley, and a JD from Loyola Law School with honors. Our next speaker, Mark Dwyer, was formerly a senior economic consultant for the Harris Economics Group, where he provided written and oral expert testimony regarding the interpretation of empirical analyses. He has directed data cleaning and the construction of empirical models, among other responsibilities. Mark also worked as a senior economist for Econ One Research Inc. and has taught econometrics as an assistant professor at UCLA. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Rochester, an MA in finance from the Wharton School, and a BA in physics from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm now going to turn the program over to Joanna Kim Brunetti.
Thank you, Gary. So what we're here to talk about today are some issues dealing with the Component 2 data. And just to provide some background, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, basically has the authority to require these annual reports, which will include this Component 2 data. And what this is part of its efforts to enforce equal opportunity laws, and as part of that, to track and research pay discrimination against certain protected groups of employees. So that's kind of the background for the authority of the Component 2 data. Okay, next slide. Now, everyone is familiar probably with the Component 1 EEOC or the EEO-1 report, but Component 2 is the pay portion of it. And this pay data reporting basically started with the Obama administration in 2016. However, when the Trump administration took over, they stayed implementation of it in 2017. It was supposed to go into effect in 2017, but it was basically put on hold. Subsequently, there was a lawsuit which basically lifted that stay, and the Trump administration, through the DOJ, has filed a notice of appeal. And so even though it is pending and it's not clear whether or not this is going to ultimately be permanent, but for purposes of the current deadlines for the 2017 and 2018 reporting year, they are in effect and they need to be complied with. So that's to give you some background in terms of the Component 2 data reporting. So next slide. So what are my obligations? Okay, so we're going to go through this in detail with regard to what the obligations are. And the first step is you're going to need to determine whether or not your company is a company that needs to report. In general, private employers with at least 100 employees have to file this Component 2 data reporting. And 100 employees consist of both full-time and part-time employees, so it's all employees. Now, there are certain exclusions. They include state and local governments, schools, tribes, and certain tax-exempt private membership clubs other than labor organizations. And these private employers in general include federal contractors. Now, one of the things that will come up with a company that isn't basically a single entity is when there are these affiliated entities. And this is going to come into play especially when the affiliated entities combined are over the 100 employee mark, whereas the one entity by itself may not be. So if your company has less than 100 employees but is owned or affiliated with another, or there's a centralized ownership, control, or management, then the enterprise of all these affiliates need to be considered together to determine whether that 100 employee threshold is met. And we'll talk about this more in detail later, but the timing of that is going to be could be critical depending on these affiliations that your company may have, because you're going to be counting employees during the workforce snapshot period. And employers are allowed to choose different periods within the time frame of the last quarter of 2017, 2018, and you can choose different periods for component 1 versus component 2 reporting. So these are things that will be coming into play to determine whether or not you're going to report for component 2 or whether you need to, and for component 2. So one of the kind of nuances that is not perfectly clear is dealing with federal contractors. For component 1 reporting, the threshold is 50 employees, but for component 2, the threshold is for 100 employees. So it's a smaller group of federal contractors will need to report for component 2 as compared to component 1. However, there's also this dollar amount requirement that is applicable for component 1, but not clear as to whether or not that 50,000 threshold is required for component 2. In the FAQs for the EEO1 reporting online portal, there's no mention of it. So even though the EOC rules mention it, the FAQs don't, so it's not clear that it's required. Another aspect that will come into play, especially around affiliated organizations that combine to potentially over 100 employees, is when there's mergers and acquisitions and spinoffs. As a general rule, it's the new entity that's going to report, or the acquiring entity that's going to report. And notably, if there's no access to the data of, say, the predecessor entity, it's important to note that in the comments. And you'll see in the FAQ further discussion on the rules on mergers and acquisitions and spinoffs. And one of the things that comes into play in particular, because you're doing both 2018 and 2017 reporting, if you depending on the acquisition or the merger, if you met the 100 employee threshold in 2018 only, you wouldn't need to report for the prior year. Okay, next slide. Okay, so once you figure out whether or not you need to report, then you need to start collecting the data. And one of the elements of the component 2 is tracking the employees by annual salary in thousands of dollars divided into 12 unique pay bands. And it corresponds to 10 EEO1 job categories, and you'll see them listed here. And these are the same categories listed for component 1. The only difference is the numbering is different, but the different types of categories are the same. Okay, next slide. Now, once you've you're going to be collecting the pay data, and for the different job classifications, and sorted by gender, race, ethnicity, and also the information that you're collecting is the wage information as well as the total hours worked. And as I had mentioned before, we're talking about 2017 and 2018 reporting years. Next slide. So what you need to do is, after you've started collecting all the data, you're going to need to familiarize yourself with the NORC portal. That is the portal for this Nonpartisan Research Institute, NORC, that the EEOC has contracted with to collect this information. You can't do any paper filings. It's got to be through the portal. And Mark will talk about this later, but the input will either be online, directly inputted, or uploaded through a CSV file per the EEO specs. And the component 2 data, once you've entered it in, it needs to be certified. If not, the data will not be accepted, and it's important to note that once you've actually clicked the certification button, that data cannot be altered or resubmitted, so it's important that you make sure all the data is there and it's right before you certify. Now, employers should be receiving their login credentials via email and mail, so you should have that at this point. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's go to the first poll question. First poll question is your organization confident that it can obtain the required component 2 data? Okay. And when we did the survey last, what we found, the results were 45% of the polling folks said yes, 33% said maybe, 7% said no, and 15% said not sure. So, the good news is 45% of the folks in the poll we're in the process of gathering the data. And now, mind you, this is due September 30th, and this poll was taken about 6 weeks before that deadline. And so, 45% are in the process. What's more concerning is that the other 55% are still trying to figure it out. They're not confident they're going to get the data in time or not sure. So the majority of the folks are still not sure about the process and what they're going to do about it. And with the deadline looming, now's the time to get ready and understand. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I had made mention of this workforce snapshot period earlier. That's the period where the pertinent folks that are going to be identified for purposes of completing the pay bands for compensation and also for the hours. So you're going to have to figure out the pay period within basically to identify the workforce snapshot period. So for 2017 data and 2018 data, you're going to be looking at a pay period in that fourth quarter. That's October 1st to December 31st. And the employer can choose the pay period. Now, depending on the way your company does payroll, it could be weekly, bi-weekly, or semi-monthly, you're going to want to pick one of those pay periods in that fourth quarter for both 2017 and 2018. And notably, you can use different pay periods for 2017 and 2018. Now, this could come in handy where if the entire enterprise or if you're just a single entity establishment, if you're fluctuating around that 100 employee number, and employers are allowed to pick a snapshot period where you're below the 100 number, provided it's in that fourth quarter. And a reminder is part-time employees are also included. Okay, next slide. Okay, so once you've actually figured out what workforce period, snapshot period you're going to use, then for all those employees that were identified in that pay period, you're going to take those employees and figure out what their annual salary, their actual salary was for that full year. And so what that's going to be is the W-2 Box 1 wages for the full year. So you've got now the employees that you've identified in the workforce snapshot period, and then for those employees, you're going to look at all of the earnings that they had as reported in the W-2. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for these employees that you've identified, you're also going to be reporting the total hours. And when you're looking at total hours, you're going to have folks who are exempt and non-exempt. If they're non-exempt, you're going to report actual hours. If they're exempt, you have a couple of options. You can list the actual hours worked if you track it, or you can use a 40-hour proxy for full-time employees or 20-hour proxy for part-time employees. So you can use this proxy if you don't actually track your hours, and an employer can actually use a mix and match between the actual hours and the proxy if only a portion of the employees are tracked. And notably, the hours worked that you're tracking are to exclude hours for paid leave, and those would include sick, vacation, and holidays. Now, a lot of payroll systems don't identify which hours are for paid sick leave versus just paid for hours worked. And so you can, in the comment section, identify that the hours worked do include paid leave as well. But the value of actually excluding that and segregating out hours for paid leave versus hours for actual work may come into play later when you are actually trying to defend against a pay discrimination claim. So having that information in there is, basically segregating out that information is important. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what I'm showing you is a snapshot of the component 2 data format. And so as you can see, this one is only for that first of 10 job categories. This is the executive, senior level, officials, and managers, and for the 12 pay bands. So you have it under job category and the number of folks within each of the salary compensation bands for the different types of categories. And you'll see the first category is Hispanic or Latino, and how many are male and how many are female. And then separately, for the non-Hispanic or Latino, the different races and grouped by male and female. Okay, and then so there's one for each of the top of the 10 categories, and then you'll see in the last column you end up totaling it. Okay, so next slide. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this multi-establishment reporting because that can get complicated. So, we talked earlier about all establishments within a single enterprise on whether or not that meets the 100-employee threshold to determine whether you have to file in the first place. So assuming that you have met it, there's multiple establishments. There are certain rules in terms of what reports need to be submitted depending on the size and the type of establishment that you have. So for each establishment with 50 or more employees for your enterprise, you're going to be looking at a consolidated report, that's a type 2. The headquarters report, type 3, and for each establishment with more than 50 employees, that's type 4. Next slide. And for those establishments with less than 50 employees, you can choose for the establishment report an option of using a type 6 report or a type 8 report. And the type 6 report basically is basically a list. And, of the categories that we talked about, the pay, the hours worked, race, ethnicity, gender, job category for all establishments in the type 2 report. That's the consolidated report. And then the establishment report, type 8, that's an alternative to the type 6. And you have to provide the same information, but the difference is if you choose the type 8 report, that the data that you enter into the type 8 report will automatically populate into the type 2 report, so there's less data entry. Okay, next slide. So basically, you're looking at 6 different types of reports. Type 1 is the sort of simple single establishment report used only for companies with one establishment. Type 2 is a consolidated report that's basically for when you've got multi-establishments. And type 3 is the headquarters one. And then obviously for the other establishments, you're going to either use a type 4 for those with more than 50 employees, or you can, if the other establishments have less than 50 employees, you can use either a type 6 or type 8. Okay. So next slide. So we're going to go to the next poll question, which is, will your organization file your reports using data upload files, or will you be inputting the data directly into the online portal? Okay, so there's 4 options. And our survey that we took recently, the answers were 36% they will be inputting the data directly into the portal. The next biggest one, 34%, was they haven't decided. 23% was going to be using CSV data files. 7% said that they were unfamiliar with the options. Well, it's important, thankfully it's a very small percentage that said they were unfamiliar with the options, and hopefully this presentation will provide information to help identify what those options are. The 34% that hasn't decided, you need to get decided. And we'll talk more about the sort of decision-making process in terms of the data files that are needed. Okay, so now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Mark Dwyer, who's going to start with the nuts and bolts of Component 2 reporting.
Next slide. Thank you, Joanna. I'm going to speak today about some of the specifics of the structure of your Component 2 data submission, and also provide an example of some methods for identifying compensation differences that the EEOC may be applying to your data, so that you have some sense as to what they're going to be doing with your data, or maybe doing with your data once they receive it. But first I'd like to note where there are some resources available to you. The most definitive resources are on the NORC website, and we have listed here one site on frequently asked questions for the EEOC, which deals with more of the technical filing requirements as to who needs to file, under what conditions, and for mergers and divestitures and acquisitions and so on. But in terms of the real nuts and bolts that we're focusing on, the NORC site under those first two links is the one to go to look at. I'll just note in passing that NORC, if you're curious, stands for the National Opinion Research Center, which is where this organization started their life many decades ago. Next slide, please. Right. So as has been discussed, there are two ways to provide your data to the EEOC. The first is entering your data online, which is manually putting the data into the web interface, and the second is to upload data files. These two links are the information on these two different methods, and they're both found on the More Info page, which is at the bottom here. We have a screenshot, kind of small there, but they're both available on that More Information to support filing at the NORC website. For my comments on the structure of your submission, I'm focusing on the upload file specifications and file validation process. One of the reasons for doing that is that if you use the upload process where you're uploading a file, then you at least know exactly what it is that you entered into the EEOC, so you have a record of that. Next slide, please. Okay, so despite the variety of reports that Joanna described accurately, the 2, the 3, the 4, the 6, the 8, and so on, there's even a 9, which substitutes for the 4 under certain circumstances. In terms of an upload file, you're only filing 2 of these CSV files, so 2 comma separated files, one for 2017 and one for 2018. And the names are upload file 2017 and then an identifier, an 8-digit user ID that you get from NORC is the next part, and then the .csv extension. These are CSV files which can be manipulated and filled in Excel, so you can look at them as standard spreadsheets, but they're a text format so that they're easily readable with other systems as well. An important point to note is that the column titles have to match the specifications that NORC provides, and that these titles do not contain spaces. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So here I show an example, and you can see here that I've rotated the column names because they are so long, and those are the actual column names that you need to use on your submission. One of the longest names there for the column is the race, ethnicity, gender one towards the right-hand side. And to simplify the conversation today, I'm going to refer to that as protected class or simply class, just to cut that down a little bit. Okay, so just a moment here. Right, so this example that I've put together here is based on an example that NORC provides in that more information page. There's a link to a file called upload file specification.pdf. And I've just expanded that for a number of reasons to give you a sense as to what a complete submission for a given year might look like. So this hypothetical company has 3 locations, one of which has greater than 50 employees. That's this first one above the highlighting. And overall has a total of 101 employees, so this would be an establishment, or rather a firm that would have to file, an employee that would have to file. And this is meant to represent a complete filing for 2017 or 2018 in the CSV format. All of these fields and the acceptable values that they can take are described in that file I mentioned, upload file specification. For instance, the class is coded with letters A through N, where A represents Hispanic males and C represents non-Hispanic white males and so on. And that matches the earlier slide that Joanna presented on the upload format. The salary groups, we saw that there were 12 potential salary groups that your employees could fall into, and those are numbered 1 through 12. And you can see on this example here on the right-hand side, there's an annual salary column that are coded with those types of numbers. And just to the left of that is the race, ethnicity, gender, or class column, which has those codings of A, which can go down to N as well. The 10 EEO1 job categories are also represented numerically, 1 through 10, and those are just to the left, one column to the left of the race, ethnicity, gender column. So you can see that all that data is being, that Joanna described, as being uploaded, and it's being coded in this sort of very efficient numerical way. A couple of things I've also wanted to highlight here is if we look at this first group, we see that we're looking at a job category of several entries under 5, which is the sales sales type of worker. And I have those in this hypothetical coming in two of these locations. So just to step back here, you can see on the left-hand side, we have a status code. And so the status code is the report type. The status code and report type mean exactly the same thing. So a status code or report type 4 indicates an establishment with more than 50 employees. Status code of 3, which is highlighted in green, just to differentiate it, is the headquarters. And an establishment, a status code of type 8 is a establishment location that has less than 50 employees. And you can see here, if we go back over to the job category on the right-hand side, that I've got sales workers which are type 5 in both the first large establishment, status code 4 establishment, and also in the smaller one, in the status code 8 one. We've got some sales workers down there. All right, and then just some more details here in terms of the class or codes. We've got A, B, C, and D types of genders, race, and ethnicities in the first establishment, and then we have an overlap between, but not in the second establishment, in the other location, the small location at the bottom. I and J are classes that are in both locations, and K is one that's unique to the smaller location. So it's just to get some sort of show some variety here in terms of how things could play out for a given filing. The last point I'd like to make on this slide is that if we just focus on those first sets of 5s in that top of establishment, and we look at the annual salary column, you see 7-1, 7-1, 7-4, and 2, right? So and 3. Okay, so we've got a lot of variation in the annual salary, and I'll come back to that, but that's something that we wanted to sort of explore in terms of how these data might be processed by the EEOC. Okay, next slide. All right, so just to sort of summarize here, we had 3 different types of reports. They're all combined into a single CSV for a given year, one for 2017, one for 2018. We have the what was on the main street was the large establishment. The one on the elsewhere location was the small establishment, and then we had a third location, which was the headquarters, which was a type 3 report. There's 101 employees. And this sort of the motivation for this is to think of this as potentially a used car dealership. And so we have salespeople, we have management, we have admin, we have some IT people in the headquarters, and we have some mechanics who are those skilled workers. And those are the employee categories that you would assign to those different groups. Next slide. Okay. So one of the things that differs from the file layout for the entering the data online versus the file upload that we're focusing on is that you saw that the upload is very condensed. There are no zeros. There are no missing values or empty spaces. And in fact, the submission is checked for that. So you don't code that you have none of class J at a given location. You just put in the ones that you do have. And you only include the salary groups and the employee, the job categories that you have at a given location. All right, next slide. Okay, so on this slide, I wanted to go into some of the details and motivations as to what this is sort of looking forward a little bit to how the EEOC may use your data. Okay, so we have these wide variations in salary groups, even for the same job category. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. This slide is describing how the example was generated. So just stepping back, there are many justifiable factors that could drive compensation differences. Most of these are not addressed in the Comp2 filing. To the extent that the EEOC reviews your submission to assess compensation differences, they are not going to be able to control for most legitimate business factors affecting compensation differences. This is why we recommend that employers conduct a preemptive pay equity audit so they can quickly respond to EEOC findings of apparent wage differences with the real story as to what might be driving those differences. The only factors that the EEOC is considering in your Component 2 submission are very broad ones, so this broad job categories and then total hours. What the point of this example is to focus on how compensation varies with total hours, because that is something that the EEOC is actually collecting. Looking ahead to subsequent slides, What types of compensation comparisons that the EEOC may conduct will be, the question is, what type of comparisons that they will be potentially making will correct for pure hour differences. So leaving aside all the things that a pay equity audit would be able to control for, even in terms of the data, the limited data that the EEOC is collecting, what types of compensation comparisons will correctly control for differences in hours. If we look at the annual column, which is, I think, about fourth from the right in this slide, on the right-hand side of the green line, a few columns over from that, you can see that in the main location, the main street location, the top rows here, that under annual, the sales force, those numbers are all 70. What that is representing is that they're all receiving the same annual compensation of $70,000 a year. Okay, so why are they ending up in different salary groups? So in this main location, we've got salespeople at 70,000, mechanics at 60,000, admin people at 45,000, and managers at 90. So we do have differences in salary groups by these job categories. But the question is, why do we have such wide variation in this example within sales itself? And you can see right next to annual, we have the months column. And what I'm proposing there is that we have that sales has a high turnover rate in this business, and that for one reason or another, there are class differences, race, ethnicity, gender differences, in who is hired at what time during the year. And that's reflected in the number of months for which they were working. And for some of them have only been working for 2 months, others for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months. And that's what's driving down their W-2 reported income. They've just not been in your data for very long. They've not been employees for very long. And so that's what's giving rise to these examples of salary group variation within the same job category. Just noting just below that, I sort of show what would happen if you had some part-time mechanics versus full-time mechanics. Again, you get salary grouping variations between groups 3 and 6, and then even a group 7 for someone who might be putting in a lot of overtime. So those are some of the sort of real-world motivations for why W-2 could vary. There are other things that, but what's important about these is that the hours are varying here, and so EEOC should be able to correct for this. Okay, we want to see what methods they might be using that should be able to do that. I'll also note that at down towards the bottom here, in the other avenue location, we do have some variation across classes in sales between 69, from 62 to 71. And so the 62 stands out in that for class J at the second location, they actually do have a low apparent wage and apparent compensation relative to other workers in their same job category. So this is not hours related, and it may be related to other things that would be uncovered in a pay equity audit, but the EEOC has no other data to explain this difference. So again, that's sort of a motivation for why a pay equity audit would be relevant. Next slide. Okay, so we've talked about these different reporting options. Joanna discussed those, and I wanted to just highlight one specific point here, is that in that first spreadsheet, you saw that we were filing a type 4, status code 4, status code 3, and status code 8. We did not file a consolidated type 2. That is done for you automatically if you use type 8 reports. The only time that you need to file a consolidated report explicitly as part of your CSV file, the only time you would have to include that is if you use the one line, just total employees at a given establishment for your less than 50 employees. That's the type 6 report. So type 6 is just a one-liner. It just says, okay, at this establishment, we've got 35 employees. And that's it. Well, if you file those for establishments, then you've got to file manually, add to your CSV file this type 2 report. So now, if you have a whole bunch of many small establishments, it might be more efficient to organize the data that way, but then you're filing that additional report. If you opt for the type 8 report, which gives the detail for each of your establishments, you can see what the type 2 report is that NORC and EEOC are constructing from your data, and that's on this next slide. So right for our example. So just, yes, next slide, please. So this is just a pivot table from that spreadsheet that we saw previously, and it's just summing total employees and total hours by salary group and race, ethnicity, gender, and job category across establishments. Okay, so that's going to be that's effectively what your consolidated report would look like. So you have those numbers, they're readily available, and you would know that what NORC and EEOC are looking at for that. Okay, next slide. All right. So before moving on to how your data might be used, I just wanted to touch on the data validation process. You need to certify your data submissions, and as part of the submission process, your data will be checked. Some of the basic things that we checked is to make sure it's a CSV format, that the column names are correct, that there are no empty rows, no missing values, that values have the correct features. In other words, that the gender, race, ethnicity is between A and N, that NAI, and so on. But there are two lookup tables that are provided by NORC, and I just wanted to highlight those. One is for your industry code, your NAICS code, and the second is for your locations of your establishments, which is city, state, zip, county. They're lookup tables, and they're checking your submission relative to those lookup tables. So you ought to use those lookup tables just to make sure everything lines up. Finally, if you did opt for a Type 6 small establishment report instead of the fuller Type 8 small establishment reports, and then you're submitting that consolidated report as well, they're going to check those against each other to make sure that those add up, just like we saw with that pivot table previously. So there'll be that additional check on your data if you go with a Type 6 report. Next slide. Okay. So this is now getting at how your data may be used by the EEOC, how it may be processed, and how your compensated data may be looked at in terms of potential compensation disparities between different protected classes. The source for the information I'm discussing right here is a pilot study that is available on the EEOC website, and we can put up a link to that later. That was done in 2015 by Sage Computing, and if you just Google EEOC pilot study Sage Computing, you'll probably pick it up right away. Next slide. Okay, so this sort of is giving you a sort of broad overview of how your data may be used, and there's sort of two different dimensions to that. There's the calculations that might be done. We'll be looking at three measures of the magnitude of apparent compensation difference and the statistical significance of those differences. So just to sort of give an overview of those, across protected classes within the same job category, what the EEOC might look at is how does the average salary group vary across protected classes? How does the distribution of salary groups vary across protected classes? And then how does the midpoint average wage of protected classes vary? Okay, we'll also look at a fourth method that seems to provide more guidance regarding those average variation, but is not as part of the pilot study. The EEOC, so that's the first point, it's like what kind of calculations the EEOC may be doing. The second point, though, is to realize that you're part of a larger whole. The EEOC is collecting a lot of data across companies, across industries, and so we'll likely look at your results and your apparent class wage disparities with respect to across your establishments. Do they vary from one establishment to another within your company, across within your industry? Okay, how do you stand out and rank relative to your industry within a geography? Okay, firms in your same area. So there are these sort of meta-analyses or macro-analyses that the EEOC you should anticipate they're conducting. It's hard to give much input into that except to make you aware of it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so to sort of discuss these different quantitative methods for assessing compensation disparities, I'm looking at a particular example. I'm looking at the salespeople in the consolidated or implied consolidated report from your EEOC filing, or from the example of the EEOC filing. Okay, so what we see here, I've arranged the data from the consolidated report by class across as the different columns, and then by salary group, and then we're just counting the individuals in those different cells. So how many of the Hispanic males, class 8, are in salary group 7, right? So there are 12 there. And then there are 6 in salary group 1, and we know why that is. It's because they started, they didn't have much time with the company in that year. Well, nevertheless, one of the first thing that the EEOC could look at is, well, what is the weighted average compensation group, salary group, for each of these classes? And that's what is listed there under that first table as weighted average comp. So what we see there is that classes C and K turn out to seem to have the weighted average highest comp rates, okay, relative to others, and that there's a pretty big variation from 3 to 7 for these average comp rates. Now, what's important to keep in mind, though, is that we're not accounting for hours here at all, right? But this is something that could be looked at, is sort of this comparison of average compensation. And that we know, since we know how the data was constructed, that for classes A, B, C, and D, that they have identical annual salaries, right? That we're just looking at differences in hours as driving these differences in the average compensation. And that in fact, Group I only differs slightly from those other ones as well. J does have a legitimate difference. That's the one that had the $62,000 employees at that second location. Okay, now right below those average weighted compensations is the second type of test, which is looking across the distribution of how employees fall between these different salary groups. How comparable are those, or how different are those? And what we see here is that there's in the red, they're highlighted very low, what's called p-values, which are highly statistically significant. So this is saying that these distributions of compensation are very different across these classes. Okay, so that again might be a flag for the EEOC. But again, they're not even using the hours data in these kinds of analyses yet. So we're going to get to that in just a minute. Right. So let's go to the next slide. So we'll take a look at hours. Okay. So here, the first step in taking into account hours would be to compute hours per employee within each of these categories. So within each class and salary group and job category, what are the average hours? So that's what's in column F. And then as we go to then one particular calculation that can be done here is to look to say, okay, so how do we bring hours into this? Well, in order to bring hours in, we need to take total comp and divide by hours to get an effective wage. Okay, so an effective wage per employee. So one way of approaching that is to take the midpoint, which is under the mid-comp column, and divide that by these average hours. And what that produces is the final right-hand side column, mid-wage. So that's sort of a midpoint wage for each of these groupings that we're looking at from the EEOC. So the question is, what do we see when we look at these mid-wage groupings? Now we're controlling for hours. And so for instance, in this first row, we have this grouping that was in an annual salary group of 1, which is very low, right? So the salary group was the low salary grouping, but their hours are very low. And so in effect, we've boosted their wage substantially. Right now on the right-hand side, you can see that top row is $42, right? So they're no longer looking like they're undercompensated. So what does the picture look like now? If we can go to the next slide. Okay. So how do we combine this information? So we have these midpoints for a given class, like Class A, Class B, and then we have these midpoints for different salary groups. Okay, so we had groups 1, salary group 1, up to group 7. By taking the number of employees in each of those groups, we can compute a weighted average compensation measure, weighted average wage, which is a midpoint wage. So here again, we have a lot of wage disparity, right? Now it turns out that Class A looks like it's the high wage group, and all other ones are lower than that. If we look at those wage gaps, they're pretty significant, and they range from 14 to 29%. Of these, the one that's not purely hours related is J. Okay, all the other ones are pure hours effect. So what this is telling us is that this mid-comp, mid-wage type of computation for trying to infer wage to assess wage differences can be off, substantially off, right? When there's significant hours variation. One of the tests that was proposed in the pilot study is a test based on this assumption, essentially, that for the people that are in a given group, that they all are approximately paid the mid wage. Okay, and that's not, sometimes it's an accurate assumption, and that's the case in this example. But that kind of test, I haven't reported it here, but it's strongly statistically significant. So based on the types of statistical significance that was considered, at least in the pilot study, you would be finding substantially statistically significant and large wage gaps between these groups, which are actually receiving the same annual salary. Next slide. Okay, so this is the fourth method. We've talked about the distribution, we've talked about the average comp salary grouping, and the looking at midpoint wages, average midpoint wages, and how we're still misled simply by the data that actually EEOC is collecting. Okay, so those first tools are not that particularly accurate for these scenarios. What this is looking at is instead looking at adjusting the wages based on the min and max comp of each of those salary groups. And what we see here is that there's a lot more overlap. Okay, so starting at the bottom, these are full-time employees in those salary group 7. Again, we're focusing on this sales group, and the majority of them are being paid into salary group 7 in terms of in terms of full annual compensation. So what you see here is that there's only one example, which is the class J, which is coming in at salary group 6, that actually does not overlap. Okay, it just meets that $30.25 cutoff point, but it doesn't overlap with those full-time groups in the green. So what I'm suggesting here is that as part of your evaluation of what you're submitting, you might want to have this kind of analysis done to see which of your apparent wage differences are actually distinct when you look at them in terms of wage ranges, as opposed to just comp ranges or midpoint wage measures. All right, thank you, and I'll turn this back over to Joanna.
Thank you, Mark. I think we're hopeful that the discussion that Mark provided really kind of reveals that even though the EEO-1 report in and of itself may not be all that illuminating, just doing some, analytics based on this raw data can reveal significant pay gaps, and pay gaps that really aren't there, but because this is a very rough brush in terms of the analytics, it can appear that way. And this is important because the data is not as confidential as you may think. Presumably, the report is submitted confidentially. However, there are ways to get around that. For example, if you go to the next slide, someone who files a charge of pay discrimination with the EEOC can submit a Section 83 request, and that Section 83 request would allow that person to basically get the charge file, and this charge file would contain the EEO-1 data. Going to the next slide. Even broader, if an actual lawsuit is filed under Title VII or the ADA, essentially you could also get this EEO-1 report and more. Now, there was a recent Supreme Court decision that provides some, protection for the information that's submitted to the EEO-1, but how much protection it gives is not clear. But as a safety measure, employers should indicate in the comments of their EEO-1 report that the data is confidential commercial data required by the EEOC, is not publicly available, and is an exempt trade secret under FOIA. That doesn't mean that you will get protection, but it could help. Okay, so next slide. So that was that FOIA request. Now, if the FOIA request is to the OFCCP, you're not going to be able to protect it from disclosure. That's going to be accessible. So, if we go to the next slide, in view of the issues with confidentiality or the lack thereof, and submitting these EEO-1 reports, we're going to talk about some best practices in the preparation of that. But first, I'll go to the next slide. Let's go to the last poll question. management at my organization has discussed conducting a pay equity audit in connection to submitting Component 2 data. And when we did this poll, 32%, the largest percentage, was not sure. 27% hadn't given it any thought. And then the other three options of yes, a good idea, but not enough time at this time, and we don't think it's necessary, all came out on the poll for 14% each. Troubling is that majority of the folks haven't thought about doing any kind of pay equity audits or weren't sure in terms of, in connection with this Component 2 data. And what Mark had talked about and the analytics, the variant analytics that come out of that raw data is what it reveals. And just submitting the report itself is not all that illuminating, but the raw data, just running some analytics on it will show potentially significant gaps. And that's why you want to do a pay equity audit in connection with it, and ideally prior to the submission of the pay equity audit. Next slide. Now, when it comes to the benefits of doing the pay equity audit, obviously the regulators are encouraging it, and there is a 9/30 deadline, so the time to do a pay equity audit is very short at this point. There should be some consideration prior to next year's submission. But as I said, if you just submit the EEO-1 report with the data, you're just submitting the data blindly without knowing what it means. And the pay equity audit will tell you what it means. Now, clearly, EEOC is doing its own analytics, so that data is being processed, and there could be something that arises from that. So knowing what it means is important. And also, as Mark had gotten into, basically the legitimate business factors, whether it's overtime, seniority, what have you, but there may be business factors that justify why there is this gap and would allow the analytics to shrink that gap or potentially eliminate it. So it's very important to do the pay equity audit and consider these factors. It also gives you an opportunity, if there is an actual pay gap that you can't, that is not justified from a business standpoint, you have the opportunity to fix it. Okay, next slide. Okay, and one thing I really want to mention, particularly in connection with confidentiality, is doing a pay equity audit with attorney oversight. That's going to give you the maximum protection possible with regard to protecting it from disclosure. So if you have an attorney oversee the process, you will maximize your opportunity to prevent it from disclosure. And now the EEO-1 itself is not privileged. The pay equity audit done through an attorney oversight may be. Okay. Now, just as we're running out of time, it's important that if you are going to do the pay equity audit, go to the next slide. If you're going to do the pay equity audit, get your data ready now. Next slide, please. Now, the data that we're looking at is hours data, ethnicity data, and pay data. They may reside in different data systems, and that data may be incomplete or it could be inaccurate, and you need to reconcile all these data files together to get that information. So it's important to start as early as you can in terms of getting the data and making sure that data is accurate. With that, we'll end our presentation, and if there's any questions, as you'll go to the next slide, there's some helpful EEOC resources, both through our company website as well as the EEOC-related website. And that concludes our presentation.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this webinar. Thank you, Joanna and Mark. If anybody does have any questions, the contact information for Joanna and Mark is on this slide, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much for listening to this webinar.